Hello and welcome to another edition of Theology in the Book of Mormon. Today I'd like to talk about an issue about which there is not as much theology as there should be, considering how often the question is on people's mind. Let me start with a story. When I was young, I was a missionary and I was serving in Belgium, and I came to know some people who were studying to be monks. There's a great university in the city of which I was serving, and from this particular monastery, if you wanted to join, you had to first go to the university and get a master's degree in philosophy, and then you would go back to the monastery for, kind of a PhD in theology. So anyway, we got to know these guys in town, and met their. They were all living together. There were three of them, I think, in one apartment with an older fellow who already was a monk, and in fact he was sort of the overseer of their academics, both in town and out at the monastery. Anyway, they very kindly invited us out to the monastery, which was a ways out of town, so we had to take a bus to get there. Had a great experience there. They showed us all around this medieval monastery. It was had been around for a long time, had been very powerful at one point in the region in terms of owned a lot of land. We had dinner with them, heard them sing some prayers. I wonder now if that was Vespers. I don't know very much about this kind of thing, but we didn't discuss any religion with them or anything like that. It was just for us to get to know the monastery. Well, at the end, this older guy, who was sort of the leader of their academic studies, he drove us back to the bus station. And we got there a little early. There wasn't a bus yet. And so I was thinking, gosh, I've never met anyone could be described as a theologian before. I'll ask him a question. And so I said, what do you think is the meaning of life, or the purpose of life? And he went, And I thought to myself, whoops, that's probably too big a question to ask. After all, it's the biggest question anybody ever has, so probably not fair. So I changed the question. I said, well, how about this? What do you believe happens to us after we die? And he thought about this for a minute or two, and he said, these aren't really the kind of questions we ask. And the thought that came to my mind is, if you don't ask those questions, what questions do you ask? Those are the questions that all human beings have had, right? And why am I here? And what happens to me when I die? So I'd like to talk about life after death, and the theology, such as there is, surrounding it, and ask what the Book of Mormon can bring to that. So most people have this vague notion that when we die, we go before St. Peter, who, the Lord told his apostles that they would judge the house of Israel, and that he would assign us a place in heaven or something like that. This is somewhat verified by the statement that Jesus made when he was on the cross. In Luke 23, for instance, you recall that Jesus being crucified between two thieves, and one of them says to him, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And I'll pick it up in verse 43. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. So if we take paradise to be kind of the same as heaven, it's where St. Peter would assign people, and it sounds very much like you die and you get assigned to a place in paradise or not, depending on how good you were or whatever. But then we read other sections in the Bible that don't make it sound like that. In particular, let's go to Revelation chapter 20. And what John the Revelator is seeing here is that is the judgment and the resurrection. Um, and it says in verse 12, 111, it says, there's a great white throne and him that sat upon it, and so on and so forth. Verse 12, and I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. And the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. And they were judged every man according to his works. Now the problem with that is it makes it sound like this judgment happens at more or less the same time as the resurrection. And the resurrection, we don't think that happens immediately when we die, right? Now we're a little confused. So is this going to paradise that Jesus describes the thief the same thing as what happens after judgment? Does this judgment happen at the time we're dead, or does it happen later? Let's turn to John chapter 5. Where it seems to, the Lord talks a little bit more about judgment, and he starts off by saying that the Father judges no man, but has given all judgment unto the Son. And then in verse 25, he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they that hear shall live. Let me skip down a little bit. Verse 28. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about judgment. He says, as I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, and so on and so forth. So once again, it sounds like the resurrection and the judgment are somewhat coincident. Perhaps the resurrection happens first, because it's only after the resurrection that we decide what kind of, or after maybe the judgment happens first, because there's two kinds of resurrections. Resurrection of life and resurrection of damnation. Anyway, it's not exactly clear. And so, but it is the question that people most often have on their minds. When they think about, is there a God, they wonder, is there a life after death, and what happens to us when we die? Well, the Book of Mormon can be very helpful here, because in fact, the people who lived at that time had the same question. And so let me read in particular two passages from the Book of Mormon. One from very early in the Book of Mormon. There was a prophet by the name of Jacob, and he is teaching his people about the atonement of Christ, and teaching them that it brings to pass not only a redemption in terms of forgiveness of sins, but also a redemption of the soul, or resurrection. That's in 2 Nephi chapter 9. And he says, oh, how great the plan of our God! For on the one hand, the paradise of God must deliver up the spirits of the righteous, and the grave must deliver up the body of the righteous. And then the spirit of the body is restored to itself again, and all men become incorruptible and immortal. And they are living souls, having a perfect knowledge like unto us in the flesh, save it be that our knowledge shall be perfect. Let me pause here for a moment and interject something. I remember years ago I became good friends with a man who was a Seventh-day Adventist. And he pointed out something from their theology that I had never thought about before. And he said, many Christians believe that there is a spirit inside man, that we live because there's something immortal, you might call it a spirit or a ghost or something, or a soul. But he says that's actually not taught in the Bible. And I thought, well, yeah, it is. But he began to point out all the examples that we can think of where it talks about the spirit of man, because in the Greek, the word is pneuma, which can also be translated as breath or air. Then it's not clear that it's really referring to any kind of immortal but immaterial being that lives within us and gives us life. And so I thought that was kind of clever to point that out. We can quibble a little bit about that, because I think there are some places in the New Testament that point that out. But nevertheless, I think he was right that most of the verses that you would reach to try to demonstrate this, if you allow this other interpretation, may not be that way. Hence, the Book of Mormon is very useful, because it tells us, yes, there is a spirit in man. And in this case, Jacob is telling us that the righteous their spirits are in a place called the paradise of God, and their bodies, of course, in the grave. But that a time will come when the paradise of God will deliver up the spirits, and out of the grave will come the bodies, and they will be resurrected and become immortal. Now, scooting down a little bit to verse 15, says, then subsequent to that, and it shall come to pass, when all men shall have passed from this first death unto life, being that they've become immortal, resurrected, insomuch that they have become immortal, they must appear before the judgment seat of the Holy One of Israel. And then cometh the judgment, and then must they be judged according to the holy judgment of God. So it sounds like he's saying there is a paradise, there are spirits, there is a paradise. Spirits are in paradise until the time of the resurrection, and then there is a judgment. Now he goes on to say that the wicked are in a place called hell, and that they also have to come forth and be baptized, or pardon me, and be resurrected, and then be judged. In fact, let me read verse 12. And this death of which I have spoken, which is the spiritual death, shall deliver up its dead, which spiritual death is hell. Wherefore death and hell must deliver up their dead, and hell must deliver up its captive spirits, and the grave must deliver up its captive bodies, and the bodies and the spirits of men will be restored one to another, and it is by the power of the resurrection of the Holy One of Israel. So, we need to see how this dovetails with what we read in John, where Jesus said, all will come forth, both the wicked and the righteous, and be resurrected, although there's a distinction between them. And what we read in Revelations, that at that point, or around about the time of the resurrection, there is a time for these resurrected beings to stand before the judgment seat of Christ to be judged. Now this suggests that the term paradise is not equivalent to what we think of as heaven. And when Jesus was saying to the thief, you'll be with me today in paradise, he didn't mean you're going to heaven. He's saying, you and I are both going to the place where spirits go when they depart this mortal life. Later in the Book of Mormon, there's a prophet by the name of Alma who goes into a little more detail. He's speaking to his son and explaining to him about how that happens, and he's making the point that hey, people die, and then there is a resurrection and a judgment, and that doesn't all happen at once, right? And he says in verse 6, now there must needs be a space of time, betwixt the time of death and the time of the resurrection. And now I would inquire what becometh of the souls of men. He's using the term souls here rather than spirits. We don't know whether that's significant. From this time of death to the time appointed for the resurrection. Skipping down a little bit in verse 9, he says, concerning the space of time, what becometh of the souls of men is the thing which I have inquired diligently of the Lord to know. And this is the thing of which I do know. So he's explaining to his son, I have received a revelation from God, and I'm going to tell you what he told me. Verse 11, now concerning the state of the soul, between death and the resurrection, behold, hath been made known unto me by an angel, that the spirits of all men, as soon as they are departed from this mortal body, yea, the spirits of all men, whether they be good or evil, are taken home to that God who gave them life. And then shall it come to pass that the spirits of those who are righteous are received into a state of happiness, which is called paradise, a state of rest, a state of peace, where they shall rest from all their troubles and from all care and sorrow. And then it shall come to pass that the spirits of the wicked, yea, those who are evil, for behold, they have no part nor portion of the Spirit of the Lord. For behold, they chose evil works rather than good. Therefore the spirit of the devil did enter into them and take possession of their house. And these shall be cast out into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and this because of their own iniquity, being led captive by the will of the devil. Now this is the state of the souls of the wicked, yea, in darkness, and a state of awful, fearful looking for the fiery indignation of the wrath of God upon them. And thus they remain in this state, as well as the righteous in paradise, until the time of their resurrection. So, what this tells us is the Book of Mormon says, first, all men have something immortal but immaterial in them that we might refer to as a spirit or a soul. When the body dies, this spirit leaves and is taken back to that God who gave them life and assigned either to wait in a state of happiness, called paradise, or a state of unhappiness, which we imagine is the hell that Jacob was referring to. And these spirits are waiting for the time of the resurrection and the time of the judgment. At the resurrection, both the wicked and the righteous receive their bodies again and stand before God to be judged of him and to receive a reward according to their deeds, as it says in Revelations. So, I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Theology in the Book of Mormon. We'll see you next time.